A blind millionaire waits in the back seat of his car at a busy traffic light in a town in upstate New York. A homeless woman knocks on the window and makes an impossible proposal to teach the man to see in exchange for the leftovers from his table. Minutes after ignoring her, a spark of light pierces his left eye for the first time in 3 years. What he doesn't yet know is that this woman holds a secret capable of changing both their fates forever. The traffic light on Independence Avenue stayed red for 42 seconds. Arthur Sterling knew this by heart because for 32 years he had passed through it every morning on his way to the office, and because the mind of one who cannot see learns to measure the world in other units, not in colors or distances, but in sounds, in durations, in the textures of the air. On that June morning, the air had a dry chill that seeped through the cracks of the slightly open window, and Arthur smelled the brewed coffee coming from a nearby diner, mixed with the exhaust of a bus idling in the right lane. 42 seconds. Time enough for the whole world to happen without him being able to see any of it. The sedan was a Volvo S90 with tinted windows that the driver, Mr. Anthony, kept impeccable out of contract and personal pride. Arthur was in the back seat in a tailored grey linen suit, his tie loosened by 2 fingers because it was morning, and because he had decided years ago that certain concessions to rigidity only apply after 8, and his white cane laid across his knees as if it were a document he didn't need to present, but wasn't going to put away either. 3 years with that cane. 3 years learning that the ground has its own language transmitted through the soles of shoes, that the wind changes direction before the rain, that people who scream are more lost than those who remain in silence. He was thinking about the development contract in Saratoga Springs when the knock came. It wasn't a timid knock. It wasn't the tap-tap of someone asking permission or someone ashamed of their own request. It was a firm knock, of knuckles, straight on the rear left window, with a rhythm that was in no hurry, but also had no doubt. Arthur turned his face toward the sound by instinct, though he knew it was of no use. Mr. Anthony made a noise of disapproval from the front seat. "You can lower it 2 inches, Arthur said. The glass slid down. The June air rushed in more strongly and brought with it a scent Arthur didn't expect. Lavender. Not the synthesized lavender perfume that comes from sachets or cleaning products. Real lavender. Fresh, with that green vegetal note beneath the floral, the kind of scent that only exists when the plant has been harvested a few hours prior. The voice that entered along with the scent was deep and calm, like the voice of someone accustomed to speaking to people who need to listen carefully. "Give me the leftovers from your table and I will teach you to see." Arthur sat in silence for a second. Then he let out a short, dry laugh, the kind that has no joy inside. He had developed that laugh over the last few years as a response mechanism to situations he considered too absurd for the time it would take to take them seriously. "Close it," he said to Mr. Anthony, "and move on when it turns green." The glass went up. The light changed. The Volvo entered the avenue, and Albany began to move again outside the tinted windows like a movie Arthur could no longer watch. He adjusted the cane over his knees, brushed away the thought of the woman with the same efficiency with which he filed away useless lawsuits, and returned to the Saratoga contract. 4 minutes later, something happened. It wasn't gradual, it wasn't a process. It was an event, precise and brief like a snap. A luminous spark crossed the visual field of his left eye, white and electric, lasting less than a second, but with a sharpness that left him completely motionless. It wasn't the kind of spark that neurologists called phosphenies, those hallucinations of light that the nervous system sometimes produces on its own. It was different. It was a memory. It was the system recognizing something. Arthur kept his hands open over his cane and said nothing. Mr. Anthony noticed the unusual silence through the rearview mirror and asked if everything was all right. Arthur said yes in a voice that committed to nothing, but inside he was doing what he had learned to do in the years without sight, cataloguing the experience with the coldness of an accountant reviewing a balance sheet. A spark, left eye, duration, less than a second. Different quality than anything felt before. 3 years of nothing, and now this. 5 minutes after a woman smelling of lavender said something absurd at a car window. He didn't believe in spiritual coincidences. He had built an empire of 42 properties across 3 counties on the conviction that the world obeys identifiable logics and that those who cannot identify them are simply not paying enough attention. But there was also, tucked away in a corner he rarely visited, the memory of the 4 specialists he had dismissed and the treatment he had abandoned. The memory of the conclusion he had drawn with the coldness of someone closing a bad deal. Some losses are final. He had reached this conclusion rationally and moved on. But there was a detail that no rational conclusion could resolve. On the morning at the traffic light 3 years earlier, when the neurologist had used that expression, incomplete optic neuropathy, and had said the words real possibility of recovery, Arthur had felt a specific fear that was not the fear of not recovering. It was the fear of recovering halfway. It was the fear of entering a process he didn't control and coming out the other side with less than he had started with. It was the fear of someone who spent his whole life controlling contracts and doesn't know what to do with a variable that has no termination clause. So he had closed it, and he had moved on, but the spark was there, recorded in the memory of the previous minute, real as a number on a spreadsheet. When the car stopped in the garage of the Sterling building in downtown Albany, Arthur sat for another 40 seconds before opening the door. Mr. Anthony waited without saying anything because he had learned, in 6 years of service, that the boss had silences that were neither sadness nor anger, but something that had no easy name and should be respected just the same. "Julian," Arthur said, when his assistant appeared to accompany him to the elevator. "The woman at the light on Independence and State Street. Can you find her?" Julian Hayes was 34 years old, with the watchful eyes of someone who notes everything mentally before any paper, and he had learned not to show surprise at any request from the boss. He noted the information, confirmed with an objective yes, and walked alongside Arthur through the marble corridor to the elevator. "How was she dressed?" Julian asked naturally. Arthur thought for a second. He didn't see, but there were the details he caught from what others let slip. Mr. Anthony had made a noise of disapproval, the kind of noise he made at something he considered out of place, and the woman's voice didn't have the texture of someone cold enough to be desperate, but it had the weight of someone who had slept in hard places. "Simple clothes," Arthur said. "White hair. She'll be near the intersection or close by. I don't know if she's still there." Julian nodded. He noted something else mentally. The elevator opened, the 2 entered, and Arthur stood facing where he knew the door was, cane in his right hand, thinking of a spark of light that had lasted less than a second and was still pulsing somewhere behind the eyes that had stopped working 3 years ago. In the office, the morning meeting went on as usual. Arthur signed 3 documents that Julian read aloud, with the precision of someone who knows that every comma is a decision. Claire, his daughter, walked in at 9 sharp for the operational review meeting, like every Monday, and presented the week's numbers with the clinical competence Arthur had recognized in her since she was 15 and already organizing her notebooks with color codes. She was 36 now, the chief operating officer of the Sterling Group, and for 3 years she had held the company with one hand while caring for her father with the other, or at least that was how she presented it to herself. Her father was fine, she told herself every morning. He was stable. He was at peace with the situation, and the company was growing. Arthur that morning did not mention the traffic light. He didn't mention the woman. He didn't mention the spark. He stayed in the meeting with his attention split between the numbers Claire was presenting and the electric memory that wouldn't leave his left field of vision, pulsing quietly like a weak radio signal that no one else could pick up. Only he knew it was there. And at noon, when Julian knocked discreetly on the door and said, in that toneless voice he reserved for sensitive information, that he had located the woman, Arthur placed his pen on the desk, squared his shoulders inside his suit, and said, "Go get her." The overpass at Washington Avenue was not a pretty place. It never had been. The concrete pillars bore decades of dampness and graffiti layered over each other like chapters of a story no one had asked to tell, and the ground beneath was uneven asphalt that collected water during rains and dust during dry spells. But at the back of the space, under the central beam, in a corner shielded from the wind rising from the boulevard, there was an organization not visible at first glance. A blanket folded precisely over a reinforced cardboard box, a canvas duffel bag with a zipper from which the corners of 2 books peeked out, an aluminum can serving as an improvised vase for 3 sprigs of lavender with their stems in a bit of water, and on the ground near the blanket, a woman sat with her back against the concrete pillar, her fingers moving over the pages of a braille book with the naturalness of someone reading on the subway. Julian Hayes stood at the entrance of the space for a few seconds. He had left the office at 12:20 and spent 40 minutes scouring the area around the Independence intersection before a hot dog vendor on the corner described, with the gentle imprecision of someone trying to help, a white-haired woman he saw every morning walking along the sidewalk toward the overpass. Julian followed the description there. "Ma'am," he said, with the voice he used for situations that needed care above all else. The woman raised her eyes from the book without a startle. Her eyes were dark brown and had a quality Julian couldn't immediately name but recorded. They were eyes that calculated, not with malice, with the kind of precision that comes from someone who spent many years having to evaluate situations quickly and make decisions with incomplete data. She said nothing. She waited. "My name is Julian Hayes," he said. "I'm an assistant to Mr. Arthur Sterling. He would like to have a word with you if you're willing." The woman closed the book, her fingers marking the page. She had completely white hair that fell over her shoulders unpinned, and wore a faded cotton blouse over fabric pants that had once been of good quality. But there was a posture in her that didn't match any of those elements. It was the posture of someone sitting exactly where they chose to be, with no apology to offer anyone. "Arthur Sterling," she repeated. The name left her mouth as if she were weighing every syllable. "Real estate?" "The Sterling Group, yes, ma'am. Commercial and residential properties. 42 developments in the region." She was silent for a moment. Then she looked at Julian with the directness of someone about to ask a question they already know the answer to, but need to confirm. "He felt a spark," she said. It wasn't a question. Julian didn't understand the phrase, but he didn't show it either. He limited himself to saying that the boss had asked him to locate her for a conversation at the office, if she were available. The woman's name was Martha Vance. Julian learned this later, along with everything else he would gradually discover about her. At that moment, he only knew that she picked up the book with the calm of someone who owed nothing to anyone's hurry, folded the blanket with methodical movements, put the 2 books in the canvas bag, adjusted the lavender sprigs with a specific care that seemed almost ritualistic to Julian, and stood up without accepting or refusing the help he offered out of professional courtesy. "I will go tomorrow," she said, "at 10 in the morning." Julian hesitated for half a second. "The boss said now." "The boss can wait until tomorrow," she said, with a softness that had no arrogance but also had no room for negotiation, and she walked away through the overpass with the canvas bag over her shoulder, her white hair catching the wind of the avenue, without looking back. Julian stood where he was for 3 seconds. Then he called Arthur. Arthur's response, after a pause that lasted longer than usual, was, "Fine, 10 tomorrow." Martha arrived at 9:58. Julian went to the reception when the doorman announced her and found her standing next to the waiting chair. Not having sat down, with the same canvas bag from the day before, and an appearance that hadn't changed at all, but, in the climate-controlled environment of the Sterling building, produced a contrast that some people in the lobby tried to disguise as a glance. Martha didn't seem to notice, or she noticed and chose not to let it matter, which Julian suspected was more likely. The elevator to the 12th floor took 40 seconds. Martha stood facing the doors with her hands on the bag's strap and said nothing. Julian also remained in silence. He was good at professional silences. Arthur Sterling's office had a window that occupied the entire wall facing the avenue, and the June light poured through it with that quality of an upstate New York winter that feels almost cold but is just clean. Arthur was standing behind his desk when they entered, which Julian recognized as a deliberate gesture, the position the boss chose when he wanted the other person to know from the start that he wasn't sitting around waiting. Arthur had a well-pressed suit, his cane in his right hand, his grey hair cut with that precision that was a habit older than his blindness, and an expression that gave nothing away. His eyes, slightly diverted from the direction where Martha had entered, as always happened because the sound orientation system wasn't perfect, had that characteristic fog of advanced neuropathy. Martha Vance entered the room and went straight to the chair in front of the desk. She sat without being invited. She placed the canvas bag on the floor next to the chair leg and pulled out an old leather-bound book, which she placed on the glass desk with a soft but deliberate thud, as if establishing territory. Arthur turned his face toward the sound. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he replied. He had the impression that her voice was exactly the same as at the car window, neither more apprehensive nor more careful, the voice of someone who doesn't change volume depending on the environment. Julian stood near the wall, discreet as ever. "You said you would teach me to see," Arthur said, direct without preamble because he saw no use in preambles. "I did," she confirmed. "And I still do." "Based on what?" "Based on what your nervous system informed me when I put my fingers on the metal of your car. Incomplete optic neuropathy. Neural pathways of the optic nerve still partially active. A system with a real possibility of reactivation through the correct stimulation protocol. And you felt the spark in your left eye 5 minutes after I knocked on the window because the tactile stimulus I applied to the bodywork traveled as vibration to your nervous system and woke something that was dormant. Did you or did you not feel it?" The room went completely silent. Julian held his breath without realizing it. Arthur stood still for a time that was longer than his custom in negotiations. Then he said, "I felt it." Martha nodded as if confirming a calculation she had made earlier. "Then here is the deal," she said. "You provide me with adequate lodging for 8 months, meals, access to materials I will list, and transportation when necessary. In exchange, I apply a visual rehabilitation protocol based on 23 years of documented clinical experience and methods that have published scientific foundations, of which I am a co-author of 2 articles. The sessions are daily, at 5 in the morning, 6 times a week. You follow what I command without using your money as an argument, because your money doesn't change the biology of the optic nerve. What I say is forbidden is forbidden. What I tell you to do, you do. And there must be fresh lavender in the apartment throughout the process, changed every 3 days." Arthur sat in silence, processing. It was the most unusual proposal he had received in 32 years of business, and it was at the same time structured with a precision he recognized. There was no emotional margin in it. It was a contract. "And if I don't recover my sight," she took a second, "then you will have spent 8 months waking up at 5 in the morning for nothing, which for a man like you seems to be the worst possible outcome. But you already know that it is better than staying where you are." Arthur remained silent for a few more seconds. Then he extended his hand toward her, calibrated by the position of her voice, and said, "Deal." Martha looked at the hand. She placed hers in it. The grip was brief and firm on both sides. "I start in 3 days," she said. She stood up, took the canvas bag and the leather book from the desk with the same calm with which she had arrived. At the door, she stopped without turning. "One last thing, Mr. Sterling. You sent for me because the spark happened. But the spark happened because the nerve remembered, and what the nerve remembers, we can teach to see again." She left before he could respond. Julian stared at the empty doorway for a moment. Then he looked at Arthur, who was exactly where he had stayed during the entire conversation, cane in hand, expression giving nothing away. But there was a different line in his shoulders that Julian, in 6 years of working together, knew how to recognize. It was the line of someone who had just closed a deal they didn't exactly understand, but had decided was worth the risk. "Arrange the apartment," Arthur said, "and fresh lavender." The apartment was one that the Sterling Group kept for visiting executives. The 10th floor of a building on Hamilton Street, 2 bedrooms, a living room with a balcony facing the park, a fully equipped kitchen, and a bathroom that had more mirrors than any non-seeing person needs. Julian removed the mirrors before Martha arrived, without anyone asking, because he had spent the night thinking about what would make the space functional for the treatment, and had reached this conclusion on his own. He also installed a wooden stand on the balcony, the kind used for pots, where he placed 3 branches of lavender in water on the morning of her arrival, bought at 6:30 at the farmer's market on Pearl Street. Martha arrived with the same canvas bag, and 2 additional volumes she had wrapped in newspaper. She walked through the apartment with her hand lightly grazing the walls, not because she was blind, but with the methodology of someone building a mental floor plan of the space for future use. She stood on the balcony for a while, feeling the morning air. She touched the lavender stems with 2 fingers and said, without turning, "A good start." Julian recorded this internally as one of the greatest confirmations that he had done something right in his 6 years working for Arthur Sterling. That afternoon, Martha sent the list of materials and protocols in writing. Julian received it in the form of a handwritten page in small, precise script, without erasure, which seemed to have been composed in one go without revision, because it didn't need revision. The list included medicinal teas with scientific names noted in parentheses next to the common ones, a sequence of exercises divided into 3 categories with technical descriptions Julian photographed to research later, and 3 items of light stimulation equipment that would have to be acquired in New York City because Albany didn't have them in stock. There was also a line at the end that said simply, "The patient must arrive at 5 sharp, not 5:02. 5. Arthur arrived on the first morning at 4:58, which Julian interpreted as a way of saying that punctuality was a condition he had accepted, but was also a competence of his own. Martha opened the door before he knocked, as if she knew the exact moment he had reached the corridor. Later, Arthur realized she had heard the specific step of the cane on the hallway surface and had calculated. But on that first morning, he just entered and stood in the living room while she closed the door and said, "Sit here." Here was a backless wooden stool positioned in the center of the room. Arthur sat. Martha stood in front of him and spent the next 20 minutes in almost complete silence, doing what he could only later name as a kind of mapping. She ran her fingertips over his temples, his jawline, the neck just below the ears, with a very light pressure that was neither massage nor examination, but something in between, and periodically stopped at a specific region and stayed motionless for a few seconds as if she were listening to something that wasn't sound. Arthur remained completely still during this process, not because the woman had asked, but because something in the quality of her fingers made any movement an interruption. It was the first time in 3 years that someone had touched his head for a clinical purpose, and the difference from previous consultations was this: the doctors touched to confirm what they already suspected. She touched to discover what she didn't yet know. After 20 minutes, she said, "The left eye is the one with the most residual activity. The right nerve is slower but not silent. You gave up on treatment before because none of the specialists you consulted knew how to work with what remained. They only knew how to measure what had vanished. There is a difference between the 2 approaches that changes everything." Arthur was silent. Then he said, "Dr. Fairfield at NYU said the pathways were irreversibly compromised." She didn't respond immediately. Then she said, with the calm of someone who doesn't need to argue with names to be right, "Dr. Fairfield is a competent professional within what he knows how to do. What he doesn't know how to do is rehabilitation through progressive stimulation of partially preserved pathways. It is a specialization that requires specific training, which I have, and he does not. This is not a criticism. It is a description." Arthur processed this. Then he did something he didn't usually do in professional situations. He asked where she had trained. Martha responded simply, without vanity and without modesty. Columbia University Medical School, with a specialization in Rotterdam for 2 years, and joint research with several university hospitals, over 15 years of practice. Published in 2 international peer-reviewed scientific journals. The last article from 2019 had been cited 47 times by the time she had stopped tracking it. "And the clinic?" Arthur said. "Why did it close?" She paused for 2 seconds, exactly 2, which Arthur counted. Then she said, "For a reason that has no relevance to your treatment, and that I will tell you when I think it's time. For now, what matters is this. You are going to drink this tea now." The tea was yellowish, slightly cloudy, and gave off a vapor with a smell Arthur vaguely associated with his maternal grandmother's herb garden. He took a sip and made an expression he couldn't completely control. Martha said without excessive sympathy, "It is bitter because the active compounds that interest us do not sit well with sugar. You will get used to it in 4 days." Arthur doubted it, but said nothing. That first morning session lasted 2 hours. Awakening exercises, which was what Martha called the first category, specific neck and shoulder movements, breathing exercises with rhythms he had to count aloud, and an exercise she called field listening, which consisted of Arthur sitting with his eyes closed and describing the sounds that arrived in layers, from the nearest to the most distant, organizing the space around him without using vision as a reference. "He is very good at this," she said later. "I've been training for 3 years," he replied, with a dryness intended to be neutral but which held a small pride he hadn't planned to show. She didn't praise him further. She just said, "This will make the memory exercise more difficult when we get there." "Why?" "Because you have learned so well to live without seeing that the mind will resist the idea of needing vision again. It will interpret it as a threat to the system you built. We will have to convince the nervous system that recovering is not losing what you learned. It is adding to it." Arthur was silent for a moment. It was a formulation he hadn't expected, and which he recognized with some uncomfortable honesty was accurate. In the first 2 weeks, the Millionaire's control was tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had expected the process to be difficult from a physical point of view. The 5 a.m. starts, the unpalatable tea, the diet without any of the things he had cultivated as small compensatory pleasures in the years without vision. The sweetened coffee and buttered toast in the morning, replaced by a grain porridge Martha prepared with the clinical competence with which she did everything. What he hadn't anticipated was the difficulty of not having control over the pace. Arthur Sterling was used to determining the progress of everything that happened in his orbit. Meetings had agendas, contracts had deadlines. The people who worked for him knew that the boss's silence was an instruction, not a pause. But Martha didn't read silences as instructions. She read them as data, and she interpreted that data autonomously, without asking if the interpretation was correct. On the 3rd morning, when he tried to redirect a perception exercise because he had found a path that seemed more efficient, she said simply, "No," and continued. The word stuck in his throat for 2 seconds. It was 1 syllable. Short, without explanation, without negotiation. He hadn't received a no like that since he had started the company. "Why?" he said. "Because the efficiency you identified is the efficiency of the system you already know how to use. It is not the system we are trying to reactivate. When you find a shortcut that seems better, it's because the part of the brain that learned to compensate for blindness is dominating the session. And that's not the part that needs to work right now." He was silent for a long moment. Then he did the exercise as she had asked. It was the kind of surrender Arthur Sterling could only make when he was completely convinced by logic, and in that case he was. Which made the surrender more bothersome, not less, because he had built his entire life on the premise that rational conviction made decisions easy. But there was something about obeying a woman who read the metal of cars at traffic lights and lived under overpasses with braille books and fresh lavender that wasn't reducible to logic and required a muscle he had used very little. On the night of the 12th session, Arthur stayed awake past 11 with the scent of lavender he had ordered to be placed in the apartment, according to her request, and thought about the fact that he didn't know Martha Vance's grandmother's name, or the reason why her clinic had closed, or any of the things that lay beneath the clinical competence he saw every morning. And he also thought that for the first time in 3 years, he had spent the whole day without once reaching the conclusion that his blindness was final. That was, he recognized honestly, something. Claire Sterling learned of the treatment on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after it had begun, when she went to her father's office for the weekly review, and Julian wasn't in the anteroom. The assistant was at the Hamilton Street apartment, delivering the week's materials, something he had started doing on Tuesdays and Thursdays without the boss needing to ask twice, because Julian Hayes functioned like that. He identified what was necessary and provided it before it became a problem. Arthur told his daughter without any special elaboration, a specialist in visual rehabilitation, an 8-month protocol, daily sessions. He was satisfied with the progress. He said this with the same tone with which he communicated the acquisition of a new property, which was, Claire knew, how he treated any decision he had already made, and was no longer up for discussion. She sat in silence for a moment. Then she asked who the professional was and where she had been hired. Arthur gave the name. He said Martha had presented herself with her experience and that he had verified enough to be convinced. Claire went back to her own office and sat in her chair for a few minutes with her hands resting on the mahogany desk, looking at the park below through the window. There were plants on the windowsill that she watered herself every week because plants were one of the few things that made her slow down. That morning she didn't look at them. She had taken over the operational management of the Sterling Group 3 months after her father lost his sight. Before that, she was the commercial director, which was an important position but limited by the fact that her father was the gravitational center of everything else. When he had left the field, first for treatment, and then by the decision that treatment would lead nowhere, Claire had expanded. She was honest enough to acknowledge this to herself, though she had never said it out loud to anyone. She had expanded not out of sordid ambition, but because someone had to, and she was the most competent to do it, and her father had left the space empty. But there was an important difference between managing the space of a father who was at peace with his situation and managing the space of a father who was, potentially, in the process of returning. It wasn't a pretty thought. She knew that. But she had learned by Arthur Sterling's side that the unpretty thought one ignores becomes the unpretty problem that explodes later, so it was better to name it precisely and manage it competently. The question was this: who was Martha Vance and what was she doing in her father's life? Claire was efficient. In 2 hours, she had gathered enough for an initial impression. Martha's name appeared in the records of the medical board, but with a note of license suspension dating back 3 years. There were 2 scientific articles with her name in co-authorship, both in English, in recognized journals. And there was, in a regional newspaper from central New York, a small note about the closing of a clinic in Syracuse due to administrative irregularities reported by a colleague without additional details. That was enough for Claire to know there was more to discover, but it wasn't enough for her to know what to do with what she had discovered, so she kept it. She waited. She continued doing what she always did, working, observing, organizing the space around her, with the competence of someone who learned that information is power and that unshouted power is double power. Meanwhile, at the Hamilton Street apartment, the mornings continued at 5 o'clock sharp. In the 4th week, Martha introduced the second category of exercises, perception. It was different from the field listening he had learned in the first sessions, different in nature, not just in technique. The perception exercises required Arthur to describe not what he heard or felt through touch, but what he imagined he was seeing, based on what he heard and felt. It was an exercise in reconstitution. The light that entered through the window at 5 in the morning in Albany in July had a specific temperature that reached the skin in a specific way, and Martha asked him to describe the color of that light. He said it was blue. She was silent for a second, the kind he had learned to recognize as agreement. The next exercise, the sound of traffic down below at 5:20, had a different pattern than at 6:30 because the composition of the traffic was different. She asked him to describe what he imagined he was seeing on the avenue at those 2 distinct moments. He described it with a precision that surprised even himself, because for 3 years he had built a sonic cartography of Albany that was more detailed than what most people build visually. But there was one exercise he couldn't do. It was the last of the perception session. Martha would ask him to choose a color, any color, and describe what it was like. Not the name, the experience, what red is like, how green feels. It was an exercise in emotional memory linked to visual experience, and it had a precise clinical logic, she had explained. The optic nerve doesn't just process images, it processes meaning. To reactivate it, it was necessary to reconnect the nervous system with the meaning that vision carried, not just the stimulus. Arthur would freeze when this exercise came. For a minute or 2, depending on the morning, he would stay quiet with his eyes closed and then say, "Let's move to the next one." She never insisted. She recorded it. She waited. On the 9th morning, in the perception exercise, she made a variation. Instead of asking him to choose an abstract color, she said, "Describe something you remember seeing that was beautiful." Arthur was silent for longer than usual. Martha waited. The window let in the July chill, and the scent of lavender was in the apartment air with that consistency she had established from day one. He began to speak in a slightly different voice, lower, not more tense but denser, as if the words came from a place with more thickness than usual. He said it was a staircase, a spiral wooden staircase in the old house he had bought in 1998 in the historic district, which he had renovated and where he had lived until the company grew too large for the neighborhood to accommodate. He said the wood was dark, mahogany, and that on summer mornings the sun from the staircase window made a path of light that climbed the curve of the steps in a way he had seen hundreds of times, but had never grown tired of looking at. And then he stopped. But it wasn't the kind of stop that preceded a let's move to the next one. It was the other kind. Martha recognized the difference without him needing to say anything. She went to the kitchen and returned with a cup of water that she placed in his hand, with the same gesture as someone providing a useful tool. No comment, no question, without the condescension of unasked for comfort. Arthur drank the water. He was silent for a few more seconds. Then he said, "My daughter walked down that staircase for the first time alone when she was 8. I was in the hallway below and didn't say I was looking because if I said it, she would have been embarrassed and stopped. So I stayed quiet and just watched." Martha stood motionless where she was, and that was how she went down, he continued. Slowly, with her hand on the railing, one step at a time, like someone practicing something new they really wanted to get right. And when she reached the bottom and saw me pretending to be busy with a paper, she smiled that way children smile when they realize they've been caught but are happy about it. The cup was empty in his hand. He didn't continue. Martha said, "That's enough for today." It wasn't early. The session had lasted the usual time, but she had learned in 23 years of practice that there is a point in every session where continuing doesn't add anything, it only wears down. And she had also learned that moments where the nervous system opens a window of emotional memory need space afterward, not more exercise. Arthur left with his cane and the step Martha had already learned to read, not the step of someone who was tired, but the step of someone carrying something they hadn't carried in a long time. On the apartment balcony, after he was gone, she stood with her fingers on the lavender stems and looked at the park below. There was a memory she was saving for the right moment. A pink cardboard folder she hadn't seen yet, but that existed somewhere in that company. She didn't know it existed, but Arthur Sterling's body had confirmed at the Independence intersection something she would only fully understand later. For now, there was only one certainty. That man's nervous system had recognized the stimulus before the mind. And that didn't happen with strangers. Julian Hayes found the folder by accident. It was a Saturday in July, 2 weeks after the 9th session. He was in the storage room of the Hamilton Street apartment looking for the toolbox, because one of the lavender stands on the balcony had come loose from the wall, and at the back of the bottom shelf there were 2 cardboard boxes that belonged to the apartment before its current use, and that no one had removed. In the first were technical manuals for equipment the apartment no longer had. In the second were folders, most green, some blue, one pink cardboard folder with a handwritten label on the tab that said simply, 1987, in a script Julian didn't recognize. He didn't open it immediately. He finished reinforcing the stand, washed his hands in the kitchen and returned to the storage room. He stared at the folder for a moment, then he opened it. The files inside were yellowed with time, with the letterhead of a visual rehabilitation clinic that existed at an address on a street in Syracuse that Julian didn't know. The handwriting in the header was small and precise, without erasures, the handwriting of someone who had developed this habit out of professional necessity over a long time. At the bottom of each file, a name signed next to a stamp. Dr. Martha Vance, M.D. Julian stood still. He read the first file, then the second. They were progress records for a patient treated over 12 weeks with a diagnosis of severe amblyopia following ocular trauma. Male, 17 years old. The patient's name was on the first file, on the identification line, in capital letters. Arthur Reed Sterling. Julian sat on the floor of the storage room with the folder in his lap for a few minutes, processing what he had read. She had treated the boss, Her signature was at the bottom of every file. She had treated Arthur Sterling when he was 17 for an ocular trauma the patient had developed, the first file noted, in an accident during a tennis match. The treatment had lasted 12 weeks and the patient had recovered in 2 weeks ahead of schedule. There was a note at the end of the 10th week, in Dr. Martha Vance's handwriting, that said, "Early discharge due to exceptional progress." Patient stopped resisting the process and began to trust stimuli he could not yet name. This is the moment when recovery becomes irreversible. Julian held the folder for a while longer. Then he took out his phone and called Martha. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Doctor," he said, "there's a pink cardboard folder in the storage room of the apartment, with clinical files from 1987, with your name at the bottom." The line went silent for exactly 4 seconds. "I know what's in the folder," she said. "Where are you?" "At the apartment. I'm coming now." She arrived in 18 minutes. Julian didn't ask how she had arrived so quickly, because there were things about Martha Vance he had learned not to ask and simply record. She entered, went to the storage room, took the folder, and went to the living room. She sat on the sofa with the folder in her lap and kept her fingers on the pink cardboard cover for a long moment. "The boss didn't tell you," Julian said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement. "No," she said. "Either he doesn't remember, or he remembers and didn't identify the connection. It was 34 years ago. He was 17. I was 27, and in my 3rd year of practice. To him, I was the doctor. To me, he was the stubborn boy who took 10 weeks to stop wanting to control the process." Julian stared at her. The afternoon light in the apartment fell obliquely through the window, and the shadows were starting to lengthen. In the park below, children were still playing. "The spark at the light," he said. It was because he had received that stimulus before. She nodded. His nervous system recognized the activation pattern. Somatic memory. The body remembers what the mind can no longer reach. 34 years is a long time for conscious memory, but the optic nerve kept the trace of the recovery process he underwent when he was 17. When I applied the vibration to the car's bodywork, that sleeping system woke up for a second. That's why the spark came in the left eye. It's the same eye that showed the greatest response in the 1987 treatment. Julian sat in silence, processing. Then he asked, "And Mr. Sterling doesn't need to know?" Martha kept her eyes on the folder for a moment. "Not yet," she said. "When he knows, he'll want to process it with his rational mind. He'll want to understand the why and the how and what it means for the prognosis, and that will interfere with the memory exercises we're reaching now. He first needs to get close to seeing in a real way again, without the web of rationalization around it. Later, he will know." "You trust that the right moment will come," Julian said. She raised her eyes to him with that quality of look he had identified the first time he saw her under the overpass. The quality of someone who calculates with precision and knows what they are calculating. "I did this for 23 years, she said. "I know when it's time." Julian nodded. He stood up, went to the balcony, and stood facing the park. After a few seconds, he said without turning, "The boss's daughter has started asking questions about you." Martha showed no surprise. "How do you know?" "Because I receive emails from her personal assistant when I'm copied on group communications. And last week there was an email to the HR department asking for information on how credential checks for service providers are performed. The email was signed by Dr. Sterling. She didn't specify the case, but the timing is clear." "She's worried about her father," Martha said. "About her father, yes," Julian confirmed. "And about other things too, I think." Martha was silent for a moment. Then she put the pink cardboard folder inside the canvas bag she had brought and said, "Keep this for me. Don't tell Mr. Sterling yet. But if anyone besides you and me touches this folder, let me know immediately." Julian nodded. It was a request that made sense in several ways he couldn't yet fully articulate, but he had learned, in 6 years by Arthur Sterling's side, to trust even before articulating. Martha left. Julian stayed on the balcony until the sun went down completely. In the park below, the children were called home one by one until the space was empty and lit only by the streetlights. And Julian thought of something that had been in the pink cardboard folder. in one of the files from the end of the 1987 treatment, in a line he had read and that had stuck. The patient has a capacity for trust that he himself does not know he has. When he finds a process that deserves that trust, he will be surprised by how far he can go. Martha had written that 34 years ago about a 17-year-old boy. And now she was treating the same nervous system at 56 inside a man who had built 42 properties on the conviction that he didn't trust what he didn't control. Sometimes, Julian thought, stories are more complete than we can see while we are inside them. The next morning, Monday, the 11th session happened as usual. But there was something different in the apartment air, something only Martha knew how to identify. Arthur's resistance was diminishing. Not dramatically, not overnight, but with the constancy of a tide that goes out so slowly, you only notice by looking at the marks on the rock. He had stopped questioning the order of the exercises. He had stopped proposing more efficient variations. He had stopped filling the silences with arguments. And when he reached the visual memory exercise that morning, and Martha said, "Describe something you saw every day and never noticed you were seeing," he was silent for 40 seconds, and then said, "The smell of the coffee my mother made when I came home from school, it's not visual, but I saw the steam coming out of the cup, and the smell and the sight were the same thing to me. They were together." Martha held on to that. Then she said, "That's what we want to recover, not the isolated image, the whole of you seeing." And for the first time since the treatment began, Arthur Sterling didn't respond with rationalization or resistance. He stayed in silence and let Martha's sentence land where it landed, like someone who discovered they had enough space for it. Claire Sterling learned of the treatment on a Thursday morning in August, 3 weeks after it had begun, when she went to her father's office for the weekly review, and Julian wasn't in the anteroom. The assistant was at the Hamilton Street apartment delivering the week's materials, something he had started doing on Tuesdays and Thursdays without the boss needing to ask twice because Julian Hayes functioned like that. He identified what was necessary and provided it before it became a problem. Arthur told his daughter without any special elaboration. A specialist in visual rehabilitation, an 8-month protocol, daily sessions. He was satisfied with the progress. He said this with the same tone with which he communicated the acquisition of a new property, which was, Claire knew, how he treated any decision he had already made and was no longer up for discussion. She sat in silence for a moment. Then she asked who the professional was and where she had been hired. Arthur gave the name. He said Martha had presented herself with her experience and that he had verified enough to be convinced. Claire went back to her own office and sat in her chair for a few minutes, with her hands resting on the mahogany desk, looking at the park below through the window. There were plants on the windowsill that she watered herself every week, because plants were one of the few things that made her slow down. That morning she didn't look at them. She had taken over the operational management of the Sterling Group 3 months after her father lost his sight. Before that, she was the commercial director, which was an important position, but limited by the fact that her father was the gravitational center of everything else. When he had left the field, first for treatment, and then by the decision that treatment would lead nowhere, Claire had expanded. She was honest enough to acknowledge this to herself, though she had never said it out loud to anyone. She had expanded not out of sordid ambition, but because someone had to, and she was the most competent to do it, and her father had left the space empty. But there was an important difference between managing the space of a father who was at peace with his situation and managing the space of a father who was, potentially, in the process of returning. It wasn't a pretty thought. She knew that. But she had learned by Arthur Sterling's side that the unpretty thought one ignores becomes the unpretty problem that explodes later, so it was better to name it precisely and manage it competently. The question was this: who was Martha Vance and what was she doing in her father's life? Claire was efficient. In 2 hours, she had gathered enough for an initial impression. Martha's name appeared in the records of the medical board, but with a note of license suspension dating back 3 years. There were 2 scientific articles with her name in co-authorship, both in English, in recognized journals. And there was, in a regional newspaper from central New York, a small note about the closing of a clinic in Syracuse, due to administrative irregularities reported by a colleague without additional details. That was enough for Claire to know there was more to discover. But it wasn't enough for her to know what to do with what she had discovered. So she kept it. She waited. She continued doing what she always did, working, observing, organizing the space around her, with the competence of someone who learned that information is power and that unshouted power is double power. Meanwhile, at the Hamilton Street apartment, the mornings continued at 5 o'clock sharp. Claire Sterling had the habit of waking up at 6:30, taking a cold shower for exactly 4 minutes, and reading for 30 minutes before any screen. It was a ritual she had developed at 28 after realizing that mornings without structure left her reactive all day, and mornings with structure left her in control of her own rhythm. Control was the word Claire used often to describe the quality of things she considered good: control of time, control of information, control of variables. On that August morning, she was in the third week of an uncomfortable absence of control regarding what was happening with her father. She had tried the direct path first, talking to Arthur about the treatment, asking for details, offering her own medical contacts for a second opinion. He had listened with the patience he reserved for situations he had already decided and were no longer up for discussion, and had said only, "Claire, I'm taking care of this. You take care of the operations. 2 important jobs, both can exist at the same time." It was a gentle phrase with the architecture of a closing. She had recognized that and left the room. So she had tried the side path, asking the HR department to formalize a verification process for service providers. She had been informed by the HR manager, with a slightly embarrassed excuse, that Mr. Hayes had anticipated the request and that Dr. Vance had already presented full training documentation, including the published articles, and that the process was regular. Julian had anticipated it. That had left Claire with a specific irritation she had honestly catalogued as the kind of irritation that comes not from a real problem, but from someone else's efficiency, taking the tool out of your hand before you need to use it. So she had stayed watching, and what she had observed in her father was, undeniably, a change. It wasn't the change she feared consciously. Arthur wasn't suddenly jovial, nor had he adopted an optimism that made things difficult to handle. It was more subtle than that. There was a different quality to the way he stayed silent in meetings, a kind of additional presence, as if the man sitting at the table occupied the space in a slightly fuller way than before. It was hard to name, but Claire named it because that was what she did. Her father was starting to expect something, and she had spent 3 years adapting the company and herself to a father who had closed the chapter on expectation. On that August morning before 6:30, she was in the group's scheduling system. It was a tool that had been implemented 2 years ago to coordinate the schedules of all Sterling Group executives in real time, including Julian, who kept all of Arthur's appointments there. Claire had access as the COO. She had never used it to look at her father's schedule because she had never needed to. Meetings were communicated to her by Julian with enough notice, and operations followed their own logic. But that morning she opened it and looked, and she began to rearrange. It was small at first, a supplier meeting that had been scheduled for Wednesday at 8 a.m., which she moved to Monday at 5:30 a.m., with a comment in the system saying the supplier had requested an earlier time. Another bank meeting moved from Tuesday to Friday. These were movements that could pass as routine adjustments if no one was looking with specific attention. She knew the treatment session was at 5 a.m. 6 times a week. If her father needed to leave at 5:20 for a meeting, the session would be interrupted. And if the session were interrupted with enough regularity, the process would lose consistency. Martha had said in a conversation Claire had accessed indirectly through a comment from Arthur that continuity was fundamental for the reactivation of neural pathways. Frequent interruptions could reverse progress. Claire hadn't thought in exactly those terms when she made the move. She had thought in operational terms. There were meetings to hold and hours to optimize. It was what she always did. The fact that the optimization, in that specific case, produced a side effect favorable to her was something she had pushed aside with the efficiency of someone who is very good at not naming certain things. Julian discovered it on Tuesday morning when he went to confirm the week's appointments in the system and found 3 sessions with potential schedule conflicts. He stared at the screen for a few seconds. Then he went to the system's edit history and saw who had made the changes and when. He held on to that information for the rest of the morning. He said nothing to Arthur. He said nothing to Claire. At 12:30, discreetly, he accessed the system and restored the original times, recording a note that it had been a typing error in the automatic synchronization. Then he bought fresh lavender on the way back to the office without anyone needing to ask. That same week, at a compounding pharmacy on Washington Avenue, an episode occurred that Julian only learned of 2 days later through a call from the pharmacist who had found the request strange and wanted to confirm it with the person responsible for the original order. The bottles of Martha's medicinal teas, which were compounded at that pharmacy with a specific formula developed by her, had been picked up that Tuesday by a person who had presented a written authorization signed as an assistant to Dr. Vance. But Martha didn't have an assistant, and the name on the authorization didn't appear in any records of the treatment. The bottles didn't go to the Hamilton Street apartment. Julian noticed this when he went to do the weekly replenishment, and the kitchen shelf had 2 fewer bottles than it should have. He checked with the pharmacy. The pharmacist told him. A whole week's worth of tea bottles had simply vanished. Julian held on to that information too. He kept both, the scheduling and the bottles. He bought the replacement teas out of his own pocket without saying anything to anyone. And he remained in silence because he had learned, in 6 years working for Arthur Sterling, that well-guarded silence is the tool of those who act at the right time. Outside of all this, the 11th week of treatment was the one that brought the first concrete sign Martha had been waiting for since the traffic light. It was a Tuesday morning, with the apartment still in the blue chill of 5 a.m., when she positioned the light stimulation equipment she had acquired in New York. A low-intensity LED device with contrast and frequency control that she had used in her clinic for years and had kept stored in Syracuse. At the home of a former patient who had agreed to keep some boxes when the clinic closed. The device produced pulses of light of variable wavelengths, precisely adjustable, and had been validated in 3 studies in which she herself had participated as a co-author. Arthur was sitting on the backless stool in the center of the room, posture correct, hands open on his knees, eyes closed as instructed. Martha adjusted the contrast to the lowest level and turned on the device. The light pulse was soft, almost imperceptible to anyone with normal vision. A diffuse white glow that lasted 1 second and went out, with a 4-second interval before the next. On the second pulse, Arthur froze. On the third, he said, "Left." Martha stopped breathing for a full second. "What?" she said, with a voice that was completely controlled but had a tense thread inside that she kept firm. "I feel it in the left," he said. "It's not the same as the spark at the light, it's smaller. But it's there, light and non-light, 4 times now." She counted. There were 4 pulses. He had recorded all 4. They weren't images. They weren't shapes. It was just the distinction between light and the absence of light, which was the most basic possible level of residual visual function. But it was real, it was measurable, and it was 4 consecutive seconds of the left optic nerve responding to an external stimulus consistently. Martha went to the window and stood with her back to him for a while. Down below, the park was still empty, the sky beginning to change color toward the east, the kind of morning in Albany that is silent in a way that feels deliberate. "Describe it to me," she said. He described it. He said it was white, not the white of a color, but the white of brightness, and that afterward it was dark. Not the usual dark, but a dark that had a different quality because it had just been light. It was the difference that mattered, the absence with the memory of presence. Martha stood facing the window for a few more seconds, then she turned and said in the flat voice of someone recording clinical data, "Very well, we continue." But there was something in her eyes, a dampness she didn't seek to hide nor display, which Arthur couldn't see, and which the empty park below had no way of recording. It was the kind of thing that happens inside people who have spent a long time in a dark place for reasons not their own, and who suddenly find evidence that the direction still exists. She continued the session, and she kept what she had felt in the same place where she kept the pink cardboard folder. in the lavender sprigs on the balcony, and in the files with small, precise handwriting from 1987, in the place of things that it wasn't yet time to show, but that were there intact, waiting for the moment when the whole truth could be told at once, without losing any part. The article was published on a Thursday in August in the online edition of the Regional Gazette, which had 15,000 followers on Instagram and an audience of loyal readers in central New York, who trusted it for local news with the kind of loyalty built over decades of honest coverage. The journalist was named Brian Lacerda. He was 41 years old, had a solid reputation for local economic reporting, and a tendency, recognized by colleagues with affection mixed with caution, to follow leads without always waiting for all of them to be complete before publishing. The title of the story was "Unconventional Method Treats Real Estate Heir in Albany." The subtitle, "Therapist Without Active Medical License Conducts Ocular Treatment of Businessman in Residential Apartment." The text was composed of incomplete truths, which is the most dangerous kind of falsehood, because it cannot be refuted in its entirety, only corrected in parts, and correction in parts never erases, at the same speed that the original statement spreads. Brian had found that Martha Vance had a suspended medical license, which was true. He had found that she had spent a period without a fixed address, which was true. He had described the method as unconventional and without official validation, which was technically imprecise because the protocols had published foundations, but sounded reasonable to those who didn't have access to the articles. And he had inserted in the 10th line of the text a sentence that was the most damaging of all. Sources close to the patient express concern about the credibility of the professional and the absence of formal medical supervision in the process. Sources close to the patient. Claire hadn't given a formal interview. She had talked to Brian Lacerda at a social lunch 2 weeks earlier, on one of those occasions where the line between conversation and source isn't clear enough for either side. She had expressed concern. She had mentioned Martha's history. She had said the family hadn't been consulted, and Brian had done what journalists do with information that seems relevant. He had constructed a narrative. Julian learned of the article at 9 in the morning because he received alerts for mentions of the Sterling name in regional publications. He read it twice. He held the phone in his hand for a few seconds. Then he went to the Hamilton Street apartment, went up and knocked twice on the door. Martha opened it already dressed with a cup of tea in her hand, as if she knew there was a reason for the unannounced visit. Julian showed the article on his phone. She took the device, read it without hurry, ran her fingers over the text as if checking the texture of each piece of information. She handed the phone back. She took a sip of tea. She stood for a moment, looking at the balcony where the lavender was in the morning light. "It continues," she said. "Session tomorrow as usual." Julian stood still for a moment. Then he said, "Aren't you going to respond?" "When there is something to respond to that makes a difference, I will respond," she said. "For now, what makes a difference is Mr. Sterling's optic nerve, and that nerve doesn't read the newspaper." Julian nodded. He left. In the hallway, before calling the elevator, he stood still for a second, thinking there was a specific kind of courage in people who have learned to distinguish what can be controlled from what cannot, and who know how to let the uncontrollable pass without wasting energy on it. It was the kind of courage that doesn't appear in any headline. Arthur learned of the article around 11 when one of the group's partners called to ask if there was anything she should know. Arthur asked Julian to read it to him. Julian read it, the whole story in a flat voice without additional inflection. When he finished, Arthur was silent for a while. The office room was completely quiet, except for the sound of the air conditioning and the traffic down on the avenue. "Send a message to Dr. Vance," he said. "Tell her I read it, that it changes nothing. Session tomorrow as agreed." Julian sent it. Martha's reply arrived in 2 minutes. One line. "Right. See you tomorrow at 5. Arthur stayed in his chair for a few more minutes after the message was sent. Then he said, without any specific intonation, "Sources close to the patient." Julian said nothing. Arthur stood up, took his cane, and said, "Cancel the rest of today's schedule. I want to go home." In the apartment on State Street where he lived, Arthur spent the afternoon in a silence that was not the usual silence of a man processing decisions. It was a different silence, with more layers. He had spent 3 years building a careful balance. The company worked. His daughter ran the operations with recognized competence. He participated in strategic decisions through what he knew and what he heard, and there was a comfortable space that no one needed to name, but everyone knew existed. A space of adaptation. But in the last months, that space had changed in quality. The 5 a.m. sessions had changed something he didn't know how to name exactly, but recognized as a kind of internal movement, as if a part of him that had been still had begun to turn slowly. There was something happening in his left eye that was real and measurable, and that he had described to Martha with the precision she had asked for. And there was, along with that, a feeling he had buried deep 3 years ago, and that was coming to the surface with the uncomfortably insistent consistency of something that wasn't dead, only sleeping. The feeling that perhaps there was still more ahead than what he had stopped expecting. The article had said nothing about clinical progress. It had talked about credentials and history and convention. None of those things had any relation to what had happened on Tuesday morning, when the left optic nerve had distinguished 4 consecutive light pulses for the first time in 3 years. At 6 in the evening, Arthur called Claire. His daughter answered on the second ring with a voice calibrated as if she had been waiting for the call without admitting she was waiting. "You read the article," she said before he spoke. "I did," he said. "And you?" She paused for a second. "Yes." The silence that followed lasted longer than usual between them. It was the kind of silence that carries a question neither side wants to ask first, because the answer will change something that is still in fragile balance. Arthur said, "Session tomorrow as usual." "Dad," she said, "shouldn't you at least talk to a doctor about what you're doing?" "I'm talking to a doctor every morning at 5, he said. "That's not what you're asking." She went silent. "See you at Monday's meeting," he said, and hung up with the dry kindness of someone who isn't angry, but also isn't available to continue. That night, Martha was on the apartment balcony with the lavender sprigs between her hands when the phone vibrated. It was a message from a number she didn't have saved, but which she recognized by the Syracuse area code. It was a former colleague from the clinic who had kept sporadic contact over the years and who now sent only, "I saw the article. I'm here if you need me." Martha held the phone for a moment. Then she wrote back, "Thank you, I'm fine. The work continues." She put the phone away. She stayed for a while on the balcony with the August air in Albany, which was dry and had that specific scent of urban highland that she had learned to associate with this phase of life. Not with sadness, not with joy, but with the kind of presence that only exists when one is completely in the place where one is, without half of one's attention in a previous place. She had slept under an overpass for 94 nights. She had sewn a patchwork blanket with the hands that had also written scientific articles and signed clinical files for patients who had recovered what seemed lost. She had picked lavender from public flower beds at 5 in the morning because her grandmother had said the smell reminds the body that it's still worth existing, and because her grandmother was right, as she usually was. The article was words in a newspaper that had described part of her story with the precision of someone looking through a keyhole and describing the keyhole as if it were the whole room. But Arthur Sterling's optic nerve had distinguished 4 consecutive pulses of light. And that was a reality no article could undo. She turned off the balcony light, went inside, and went to sleep at 10:30 because the session was at 5 and sleep was part of the protocol. The next morning, Friday, Arthur arrived at 4:58. Martha opened the door. The tea was prepared, the stool in the center of the room, the stimulation equipment in Tuesday's position. They worked for 2 hours without mentioning the article. Not because they were going to pretend it didn't exist, but because each in their own way had reached the same conclusion. There were things that mattered to the process and things that didn't. The article didn't matter to the optic nerve, and the optic nerve was, at that moment, the center of both their universes. In the 13th session, the left eye distinguished 5 consecutive pulses. Martha recorded it without comment. Arthur said, "It's getting clearer." She said, "I know." And they continued. The truth, when it finally came to light, did not arrive with a bang. It arrived with the silent inevitability of things that had been accumulating for too long to fit inside a single space. And the space that could no longer contain it was the 12th floor office on a Monday in September, during an operational review meeting that had started like all the others and ceased to be like all the others when Arthur Sterling placed his cane on the table and said, without preamble and without his usual patience, "I want to know what is going on." There were 3 people in the room, Arthur at the head, Claire on the left, Julian on the right, standing as always, with the notepad he no longer needed because he had learned to file everything mentally. Arthur's sentence fell in the center of the table like a stone in still water, and the 3 stayed motionless for a second before the ripples. Claire said, "Operations are running well. August numbers were above target." Arthur turned his face toward his daughter's voice, with that precision he had developed in 3 years of sonic navigation. "It's not about operations," he said. "You know what it is." The silence that followed was different from the silence of other meetings. It had texture. "Julian," Arthur said, without taking his face from Claire's direction, "do you tell me, or do I keep waiting?" Julian stood with his pen motionless over the pad. He had kept 2 pieces of information for weeks: the altered scheduling, the missing tea bottles. He had corrected both in silence because he believed the process should continue and that premature interruption would harm the patient. But he had reached a point the previous week where keeping the information had stopped being protection and started being complicity with an incomplete version of the facts that the boss deserved to know. There was also, weighing on this, something more personal. Julian Hayes had worked 6 years for Arthur Sterling, with the conviction that this work required absolute honesty as a condition of meaning. And he had reached the limit of what he could keep in silence without compromising that conviction. So he told him. He told him with the objective voice he used for reporting data, without additional inflection, without explicit judgment. He recounted the alteration of the times in the scheduling system, with date, time, and edit record. He recounted the pharmacy episode, with the name of the pharmacist who had called to confirm and the description of the fake authorization. He recounted that he had corrected both situations silently and replaced the bottles out of his own pocket. He recounted that he had kept the information waiting for the right moment and that he had decided that moment had arrived. When he finished, the room was silent long enough for the sound of the air conditioning to become audible. Arthur stayed motionless with his hands on his cane, the kind of immobility that wasn't paralysis but processing. He organized the information with the same efficiency with which he had organized 32 years of business, putting each piece of data in its corresponding place within an architecture that was taking shape while he stayed quiet. Claire stared at the center of the table. There was a small plant in the center of the conference table that she had placed there 2 years ago because she said plants made environments more human. She was looking at it now with the intensity of someone who needs a fixed point. Arthur said, "You went to talk to Lacerda." It wasn't a question, it was the conclusion of a deduction. Claire was silent for 2 seconds. Then she said, "I talked to him in a social conversation. I didn't give a formal interview. You gave him the information he needed to write what he wrote." She raised her eyes from the plant. "Dad," she said, "I was worried." "About what exactly?" The sentence hung in the air. Claire stared at her father, at the face she had known since she had learned to read faces, at the eyes that didn't see but were pointed precisely in her direction, as if they saw everything that mattered. She said, with an honesty that cost something, "About the company, about the group, about what could change if the treatment worked." The room went silent. Arthur processed that. Then he said, with a voice that had no anger but had weight, "You're telling me that the problem was that I might see again." "It's not like that," she said. "How is it then?" She was silent. And then she said something she clearly hadn't planned to say, but that came out because she had reached that point where words are heavier than restraint. "For 3 years, I held everything together. The company, the decisions, the crises, while you were adapting. And I did it well, I know I did it well, but I learned to do it within a structure where I had enough space, and when the possibility of that structure changing appeared, She stopped. Arthur waited. "I was afraid," she said. Not of your recovery, but of no longer knowing where I stood within it. The silence that followed was of another quality. Not the silence of tension, but the silence of something that had been said with enough precision to be true, and that landed in the room with the specific weight of truths people keep for a long time before naming. Arthur was silent for a long moment. Then he said, with a voice that was lower than a meeting tone, but had a density inside that Julian recognized as the voice of important conversations. "Do you know what I discovered in these months of treatment?" Claire waited. "That I was also afraid," he said. "For 3 years, not of not seeing, of seeing halfway, of doing a whole process and coming out the other side with less than I had started with. It was easier to close down than to risk it, so I closed down. And you took over the space I left empty and did it very well, as I knew you would, but neither of us talked about that fear. And then when the possibility of the space changing appeared, the two fears came into conflict without either knowing the other existed." Claire stared at her father for a moment. There was a muscle in her jaw that Julian had learned to identify as the muscle that tightened when she was holding back something she didn't want to be seen. The conversation didn't reach a resolution that afternoon. Arthur didn't say everything was fine because it wasn't yet. Claire didn't apologize fully because there were things that still needed to be processed before the apology was honest enough to be worth it. But when Arthur said at the end that the session continued and that the treatment was not up for discussion, and that what was up for discussion was how the three of them were going to rebuild the trust that had been compromised, there was something in the room that hadn't been there at the beginning. Open windows where there had been walls. Julian left before the other two. In the hallway, leaning against the wall next to the elevator, he stood for a moment with his eyes closed. He had done what he believed was right. He had said what needed to be said. And there was, along with the expected relief of someone depositing a weight kept for a long time, a kind of silent respect for what he had seen inside that room. Two adults, father and daughter, getting close to the same truth through different paths, without any of the elegancies people usually put around difficult conversations. It was the kind of scene that rarely happens with such clarity, and when it does, one thinks about it for a long time afterward. That night, Julian sent a message to Martha. One line: "Conversation happened. It's open." Martha's reply arrived 10 minutes later. "Thank you. Rest tomorrow at 5. Julian smiled at his phone on an empty bus on the way home. Then he put the phone away and stared out the window at the lights of Albany passing by, that upstate town that had 42-second traffic lights and old concrete overpasses and lavender markets at 6 in the morning, and that had become, without anyone planning it, the place where a story that had begun 34 years ago in Syracuse was reaching the point where it finally made whole sense. Claire Sterling didn't sleep well for the 2 nights following Monday's meeting. It wasn't the kind of insomnia that comes from acute guilt, with racing thoughts and a body that won't quiet. It was the insomnia of people who process slowly and honestly, who stay awake not because they are suffering, but because they are organizing, like someone tidying a drawer that has been closed for a long time and is now open and needs to be reviewed item by item. She had told her father the truth. Not the whole truth, because there were parts she was still naming for herself, but a truth enough for the conversation to have been real. And there was something in that honesty that, instead of providing immediate relief, had first made things heavier, because truths kept hidden build a semblance of lightness by absence of weight, and when they come to light, they reveal how much they were there all along, occupying space without being seen. On Wednesday morning at 11, Claire went to the Hamilton Street apartment. She hadn't given notice. She had left the office with the excuse of an external meeting, had asked the driver to stop at the corner of the building, and had gone up alone in the elevator. Something she rarely did because she had learned from her father that going accompanied to unknown places was a form of control, and because she was trying, consciously, to exercise the opposite thing. She rang the bell. Martha opened the door with an expression that showed neither surprise nor hostility. She was in a kitchen apron and holding a wooden spoon with traces of a concoction that smelled of herbs and ginger. Her white hair was tied up haphazardly with an elastic that had clearly been the closest available tool. "Come in," she said. and went back to the kitchen without waiting for an answer. Claire entered. She stood in the living room for a moment, looking at the apartment she had ceded for her father's treatment, and which now clearly had a different habitation than that of the visiting executives for whom it had been intended. Lavender was on the balcony in 2 pots. There were books stacked on the coffee table, some in Braille, 2 in normal print with markers in them. The backless stool was in the center of the room with a folded towel on top, and the light stimulation equipment was on the dining table, protected by a cotton cloth. Martha returned from the kitchen without the apron. With 2 cups of tea she placed on the table without asking if Claire wanted any. "Sit," she said. Claire sat on the sofa. Martha sat in the armchair opposite, with the upright posture that was in everything she did, and which wasn't rigidity, but a kind of structural integrity, like a tree that grew with the wind and stayed straight in every way because of it. The 2 were silent for a moment. Then Claire said, "I know what I did." Martha stayed silent, waiting. "I altered the scheduled times to create conflicts with the sessions," Claire continued. "I made the tea bottles disappear. I passed information to Lacerda that resulted in the article. I know all 3 things were wrong, not in a way that I didn't know at the time they were wrong. I knew." Martha stared at her with those calculating eyes. Then she said, "Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to hear it from me and not piece it together on your own, and because I needed to say it out loud, and my father already heard the larger version, but you are part of this, and also have the right to hear it." Martha was silent for a moment. Then she said, "What did you expect would happen?" Claire held the cup in her hands without drinking. "That the treatment would lose consistency," she said. "That he would get impatient, that you would leave, that everything would go back to how it was before. And what was before was preferable." Claire was silent. Then she said, with the honesty she had been practicing for the last 2 nights, "It was predictable. The before I knew how to manage." Martha looked at her for a long time. Then she said something Claire hadn't expected. "I understand." Claire raised her eyes. "Not what you did," Martha continued. "Not the sabotage, but what was underneath it. I spent 15 years building a clinic that was mine, that I controlled, where the variables were manageable because I had built the systems for them. And when I lost it, I didn't just lose the clinic. I lost the whole space where I knew who I was. I spent months thinking the hardest part was the address, but the hardest part was no longer knowing what to do with my hands, with the knowledge that was still here, with the competence that hadn't gone anywhere, but without the space where that knowledge had meaning." Claire sat in silence, listening. "You lost the space where you knew who you were," Martha said. "Not the office space, the space of being the one who takes care of your father. And when that space threatened to change, you did what anyone does when they're afraid of losing what defines them. You tried to keep things where they were. It's human, it's wrong, but it's human." Claire held the cup for a moment. Then she said, "You're being more generous than I deserved." "I'm being precise," Martha said. "Generosity without precision serves no one. What you did caused real damage to the process, to my work, to your father's trust. That needs to be corrected. But the reason why you did it isn't monstrous. It's the fear of someone who didn't have enough space to be who they wanted to be, while their father was whole, and who learned to be when the space opened, and who now fears losing that learning." The 2 remained in silence for a time that wasn't uncomfortable. Through the apartment windows came the September sun, warmer now than August had been, and the scent of lavender was in the balcony air mixed with the ginger still coming from the kitchen. "There is one thing you can do," Martha said. "Not for me, for what is right." Claire waited. "The article is still published with incomplete information that harms me professionally. You have access to Lacerda. You can correct what can be corrected." Claire was silent for a moment. Then she nodded. A simple tilt of the head, without drama, the kind that corresponds to a fully made decision. "I will talk to him myself," she said. "I won't ask him to take it down. I'll ask him to correct it with the same visibility he gave the original, a retraction note with the full facts." Martha was silent. Then she said, "And the full training records are available if you need the documents." "I have access to what HR already verified," Claire said. "It's enough for the retraction." The two stayed for another moment in silence. Then Claire stood up, placed the cup on the table and looked at Martha with the directness of someone saying, "What is, and not what it seems. Thank you for the honesty. I knew you were competent by what I saw in my father, but I didn't know you were like this." Martha didn't ask what "like this" meant. She had understood. Claire left. In the elevator, descending the 10 floors in silence, she kept her hands on her purse strap and thought about a sentence Martha had said. "What you did caused real damage. That needs to be corrected." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a long time, without softening and without cruelty, with the clinical precision of someone who knows the truth, doesn't need to be violent to be exact. That afternoon, Claire called Brian Lacerda. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. When it ended, Brian had agreed to publish a retraction note in the same channels as the original article, with the correct information about Martha's training, published articles, European specialization, and documented clinical history. The note would be published the following week. And Brian had said, with the journalistic honesty of someone who recognizes when they've made a mistake, "I should have investigated more before publishing. The story you told me seemed complete, but it wasn't." "It rarely is," Claire said. When she hung up, she stood for a few minutes on the balcony of her own apartment, which was in a different building from the one she had ceded for the treatment, but which had the same view of the park, because Albany was a city where certain landscapes repeated in ways that seemed like coincidence, but were just urban geometry. She stood looking at the trees below and thinking about what her father had said in the meeting. Neither of us talked about that fear. It was true, and there was a specific lightness in the truth now being told, even if the work of reorganizing what she had disjointed was still to be done. Because things that are spoken can be worked on. Those that stay hidden keep building pressure underneath until the structure can't take it anymore and opens where it isn't safe to open. She had opened where she had chosen, and that, she realized, was different. The retraction note was published on a Monday in September with the title "Correction. Professional has license and extensive clinical history." The text was direct and without circumlocution, Brian Lacerda's clean writing when he was being honest without reservation. The previous article presented incomplete information about Dr. Martha Vance. The professional holds a degree from Columbia University Medical School, specialization in visual rehabilitation from the University of Rotterdam, 15 years of practice with documented clinical history, and co-authorship in scientific articles published in international peer-reviewed journals. The professional license is in the process of review due to administrative issues. The original report did not adequately contextualize these data. This publication regrets the error. Julian read it to Arthur in the office at 9 in the morning. When he finished, Arthur was silent for a moment, then he said, "Was it Claire? It was," Julian confirmed. Arthur nodded slowly. Then he said, "Send her a message saying I read it." Julian sent it. Claire's reply arrived quickly. "Okay, see you Monday." It was the kind of communication between the two that had always been like that, objective and without ornament, because when the two were good with each other, they didn't need more than that. It was when they were bad that the silence between messages became too heavy. Martha received the news from Julian, who had forwarded the note by message with a line underneath, "Published today." She read it, held the phone for a moment, and then put the device on the table and went back to the clinical file she was reviewing. She didn't send an immediate reply. She sent one at night, one line. "I thank Julian for everything he has done throughout this time." Julian held that message for about 2 minutes before putting his phone away. It was the kind of recognition that asks for nothing back, the kind that has more weight exactly for that reason. That week, Arthur called a meeting with the Sterling Group's lawyers. It was a 3-partner firm that had been linked to the group for 18 years, specialized in real estate and corporate law, but with broad experience in other fronts. Arthur entered the meeting with his cane and his shoulders, in the position the lawyers recognized as that of the boss, who had made a decision and was there to execute, not to deliberate. "I want to reopen a case," he said. "Civil liability. A false report that resulted in the closing of a clinic and the suspension of a professional license. The case is a doctor in Syracuse. The facts occurred 3 years ago. I want to know if there is a legal basis for a review and compensation action." The senior lawyer, a man named Robert Sterling, no relation, who had learned not to show surprise at any request from the client in 18 years, noted it down and said he would need the original case documentation. Arthur said he would provide it. Then he said, "If there is a basis, I want to move with the maximum available evidence. Testimonies from former patients, technical analysis of the original reports, any element that questions the validity of the evidence that supported the report. It's not revenge, it's correction." Robert said, "Understood. We will check the case." Arthur left the meeting and went straight to the Hamilton Street apartment. It wasn't a session day, it was Wednesday. But there were things that couldn't wait until Friday. Martha opened the door. She saw the cane, saw the posture, saw something in the line of his face that was different from usual. She stepped back to give him space. He entered. "My lawyers are going to file for a review of the case that closed your clinic," he said. "I've already requested documentation. I'll need the names of former patients who can testify, technical reports you've kept, and any element that questions the authenticity of the original evidence. It's not as payment for the treatment." "As correction," she said. "I know." The two words landed in the space between them with the exact weight of what they were. A mutual recognition that both were speaking the same language, the language of people who prefer precise terms to comfortable metaphors. She went to the bedroom desk and returned with a folder of documents she had kept organized over 3 years, with the same meticulousness with which she had kept the clinical files in 1987. In it were technical reports, articles, correspondence, the original record of the report, and a notebook with names and contacts of former patients she had listed at the time, predicting that one day she might need them. There were also, in a separate envelope, 3 photographs she had taken of letters the involved colleague had sent her before the report, letters suggesting there was pressure from other elements besides professional jealousy. She held the folder out to Arthur. He reached out his hand. She placed the folder in his hand carefully, like someone passing a valued object to someone trusted. "When my lawyers need to talk to you, Julian will organize it," Arthur said. "Right," she said. He stayed for a moment longer. Then he said with a voice lower than his business tone, "You knew from the traffic light that you were going to be able to convince me to trust the process." She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "I knew your nervous system would trust it. You were a consequence of that." Arthur held on to that. There was an honesty in that answer that he recognized as the honesty of people who are precise even when precision is uncomfortable. And there was something else underneath it, something he still couldn't completely name, but that was becoming clearer every week, like the difference between light and shadow he had begun to perceive in his left eye. He returned to the office with the folder under his arm. Julian was in the anteroom and raised his eyes when he saw him enter with that posture. Arthur handed him the folder and said, "Take this to Robert and send flowers to Dr. Vance this afternoon." Julian noted it down. Then he asked, "What kind of flowers?" Arthur paused for a second. "Lavender, if they have it." "There are lavender flowers," Julian said, "but they aren't usually sold in a formal bouquet." "Then bring a sapling," Arthur said, "for her to plant wherever she wants when all this is over." Julian left, and Arthur went to his room, placed his cane on the hook next to the door, and stood for a moment facing the window that looked out over Independence Avenue below, with the afternoon traffic moving in a flow he heard as sonic texture, as he had learned to hear everything. But there was that afternoon something different in what reached the senses that still worked, a kind of anticipation, not the anxious anticipation of someone waiting for something that might not arrive, the calm anticipation of someone who already feels that the direction exists, that the path is open, that what comes next is a consequence of what has already been done and no longer depends on convincing anyone of anything. He had begun to trust what he couldn't see, and this time, unlike 34 years ago when he was 17 and had done it without knowing what it was, he was doing it with full consciousness, which made the trust harder and at the same time more solid, because things chosen with consciousness build a different kind of foundation than those built by accident. On the apartment balcony that afternoon, the lavender sapling arrived in a clay pot with a note from Julian that said simply, "For when you choose the place." Martha held the pot in her hands for a long moment, feeling the weight of the damp earth, the scent of the young stems that hadn't yet bloomed. Then she placed it in the corner of the balcony with the others and stood looking at all of them together with the kind of expression Julian, if he had been there, would have recognized as the expression of someone who is exactly where they chose to be, and who knows that this, of all things, is the rarest. The 5th week of the 5th month arrived with October, and the heat that upstate New York accumulates before the rains, that dry late afternoon heat that warms the asphalt until it releases the specific smell of a city that was hot all day. Albany woke up earlier when the heat arrived, and at 5:01 a.m. the Hamilton Street apartment was already with a luminosity slightly clearer than it had been on June and July mornings. Arthur noticed this. He had learned to notice the quality of light even before he began to distinguish it visually, by the way it reached his skin, and by the way it changed the sound of the apartment, because light alters the way sounds behave in spaces with windows, and he had become sensitive to this over the months. But that morning there was something different in the way the light arrived, a quality he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. Martha had set up the stimulation equipment with a different configuration than in previous weeks. She had increased the contrast level to the 3rd band of the protocol, which meant the difference between the light pulse and the darkness between pulses was greater. She had also decreased the interval between pulses from 4 to 3 seconds, which required the nervous system to process the information with more speed. It was the progressive visual load configuration she had been reserving for when the previous indicators were solid enough. And they were. In the last 3 weeks, the left eye had consistently responded to 7, 8, 10 consecutive pulses. In the last session on Friday, it had responded to 12. It was a progression Martha had recorded with the coldness of her clinical data and had processed internally with an emotion she kept separate from the coldness by professional rigor. Arthur sat on the stool. Martha turned on the equipment. The first 4 pulses passed as usual. Arthur reported left, 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 with the objective voice he had developed for session reports. But on the 5th pulse, he was silent for a second longer. Martha stayed motionless. "Right," he said. Smaller. But it was there. She turned off the equipment. She stood where she was for a moment. Then she said with a voice completely controlled, "Describe it." He described it. He said that in the right eye, something had arrived that wasn't as sharp as what the left produced, but that had the same nature, a distinction between the presence of light and the absence of light, brief and real. And that in both eyes at the same time, in that 5th pulse, there was something he couldn't describe with the language of what he felt until then, because it wasn't just a distinction of light and shadow. It was shape. It was the outline of something. Martha said, "What were you facing?" "The window," he said. "The living room window." She walked to the exact spot where he was sitting. She looked at the window. The window was a rectangle of October light, with the blinds partially open, producing lines of contrast between brightness and shadow that were, for those who see, one of the most recognizable patterns of everyday visual perception. Light entering through a window. "You distinguished the outline of the window," she said, with both eyes. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, with a voice that came from a place deeper than usual, "Both." Martha went to the window and stood with her back to him, not because she needed the landscape to concentrate, but because she had learned in 23 years that there are moments when the professional needs a physical space that is not the patient's space, to process without the processing contaminating what the patient is feeling. The park was down there as always. The October trees were turning green again after the winter. A dog crossed the path with a woman holding its leash. A child ran toward the playground. It was the absolutely common landscape of an October morning in Albany, and Martha looked at it with the awareness that it was the landscape of a moment that wasn't going to be repeated. The moment Arthur Sterling's nervous system had distinguished shape for the first time in 4 years. When she turned, There was something in Arthur's expression she hadn't seen before in the sessions. It wasn't joy in the way joy usually appears, expansive and loud. It was something quieter and deeper, like a quality of silence that has a density inside that didn't exist before. It was the silence of someone who has just verified that a thing they had decided no longer existed does exist. She didn't look away. It was the kind of moment that needed a witness, not a diversion. And she had learned from her profession and from life that looking away from a difficult moment because it is difficult is a form of abandonment people rarely name, but always feel. Arthur cried. Not the controlled crying of someone holding back. The crying of someone who stopped holding back. The kind that comes from the places that stayed in the dark for too long and find in the brightness, even if imperfect, the exit they needed. It was a cry without apology and without performance, the most honest kind there is. Martha stayed where she was. Then she said, with the voice she had calibrated over 23 years, to be firm and gentle at the same time, without either quality dominating the other, "You don't need anyone else looking away." The sentence hung in the air. Arthur was silent for a moment after hearing it. Then he said, with his voice still heavy but stabilizing, "What does this mean?" "It means you spent 3 years in a dark that was real, but also had the cooperation of everyone around you, including yourself, who treated it as final. Every time someone looked away or changed the subject or didn't say what was difficult, they were confirming that the dark was permanent. And it wasn't." Arthur held on to that for a while. Then he said, "You never looked away either." She said, "It's not my habit." And there was in that answer something that went beyond the clinical session, and that both knew without needing to name it, was the description of a way of being in the world that Martha had maintained even under overpasses with Braille books and public flowerbed lavender, even with the clinic closed and the house sold, and the friends gone, and her name published in a newspaper with information that wasn't the whole story. She had maintained it because it was what she was before everything that had happened, and none of that had managed to change it. Arthur stayed for a few more minutes on the stool before standing up. When he stood, his posture was different. Not different in a dramatic way, but different in the way the postures of people who have internally changed something that hasn't yet found full visible expression but has already changed the way they occupy space, become different. Martha said, "In the next session we will work on progressive load with shape variation. The right eye will need more stimulus to get where the left is, but it's responding, and that's what matters." Arthur nodded. He took his cane. He went to the door. He stopped before opening it. He said without turning, "When you decide it's time to tell me what closed the clinic, I'm listening." She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Soon." He left, and Martha stayed in the room with the equipment still on the dining table and the window lit by the October light, which now had an additional meaning that hadn't been there an hour before. It was the window Arthur had distinguished. It was the window the nervous system had recognized as shape. She went to the balcony. She stood with her hands on the stems of the lavender sapling Julian had brought, still in the clay pot, still without having bloomed. And she thought there was a right time for everything, and that the right time to tell Arthur Sterling she had been the doctor who had treated him when he was 17, was coming with the same calm inevitability with which the optic nerve had come to distinguish the outline of a lit window in a 10th-floor apartment in Albany on that specific October morning, which she wasn't going to forget as long as she existed. That afternoon, she called the former colleague from Syracuse who had sent the message when the article came out. They talked for 40 minutes. The former colleague had kept in touch with other former patients of the clinic over the 3 years, and there were 2 who had said independently of each other that they would be willing to testify if there were a formal action. The review process, with Arthur's lawyers working, now had the material it needed. The truth was entering the field as Martha had thought that morning seeing the article, but not in the hurried way that haste usually produces, in the solid way that only patience builds. The last formal session happened on an October morning, with the smell of imminent rain in the air. In that way the highlands announce water before the water arrives, a smell of warm earth and moisture mixed that those born in upstate New York learn to recognize before anything else. Arthur arrived at 4:56. which was the earliest arrival of all 8 months, and Martha was already standing when the key entered the lock. The session lasted 2.5 hours, the longest of the whole process. They worked on progressive visual load with shape variation, contrast patterns, and for the first time, color. Martha had developed over the last weeks a sequence of low-saturation chromatic stimuli that the protocol reserved for the final phase, the one in which the system already showed enough consistency of response to deal with more complex information. Red first, because the wavelength of red is the longest and the most accessible for partially preserved pathways. Then yellow, then blue. When the blue pulse came, Arthur was silent for a second longer than the previous ones. Martha waited. "This one is different," he said. "Deeper." "It's blue," she confirmed. They both stayed in silence for a moment. It was the first color he had distinguished in 4 years. Not the whole color, not with the saturation of someone who sees normally, but a quality of perception that was unmistakable. There was something there that was blue, and that the nervous system had recognized as such. After the session, Martha served the tea she had prepared while he rested in the reading chair she had placed in the corner of the room for the breaks between exercises. This time, there was sugar in his cup. "You put sugar in," he said when he tasted it. 8 months have passed," she said. "The protocol can be ended with sugar." He smiled. It was a different smile from the derisive smile he had given at the Independence light when she had knocked on the Volvo's window. It was the smile of someone who had arrived somewhere and who recognized the path that had been necessary to get there. Then she told him. She told him in the way she had saved for that moment, direct, without dramatic preamble, with the calm of someone saying something that has been true for a long time and has finally found the right time to be said out loud. She said there was a pink cardboard folder in the apartment storage room, that Julian had found it, that inside were clinical files from 1987 signed by her, with the name of a 17-year-old patient who had recovered from severe amblyopia in 10 weeks, because he had stopped resisting and started trusting what he couldn't see. Arthur stayed motionless with the cup in his hand. Martha continued. She said the spark at the light hadn't been a coincidence, that his nervous system had recognized the stimulus she had applied because that stimulus had been applied before, 34 years ago, to the same nerve, by the same pair of hands. That somatic memory is the body keeping what the mind no longer reaches. That the left optic nerve had kept the 1987 recovery process for 3.5 decades and had recognized, in the cold metal of an imported sedan at a traffic light in Albany, the vibration that had reactivated it before. Arthur's cup was motionless in his hand. The rain had started outside, slowly, the way October rains usually start in the Highlands. First, the individual drops on the asphalt, then the consistency, then the smell of earth that fulfills what it had promised. "Do you remember me?" he said. The voice had come out lower than he had planned. She said, "Not the name at the time, but the boy, the stubbornness. How you stopped complaining about the bitter tea on the 7th day and never complained again because you had internally decided you were trusting. I wrote in the files that you recovered sooner than expected because you stopped resisting the process, that there was a capacity for trust in you that you yourself didn't know you had." Arthur held on to that for a long time. The rain was stronger now, hitting the living room window with that persistence that October rain has when it decides it has arrived. Outside, the park was getting wet, and the people on the street were running, or opening umbrellas, or standing under awnings waiting. 34 years, he said. The nerve kept it, she said. The body sometimes knows what the mind doesn't reach. He was silent for another moment. Then he said, with a voice that had found a different, more grounded stability, "You knew since the light." "I suspected since the light," she said with precision. "I knew when I saw the files. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "For the same reason you didn't tell me in the first months that you were afraid of seeing halfway," she said, "because there was a right moment. And the right moment isn't as early as possible. It's the one that finds the person ready for what the truth demands of them." Arthur held on to that answer. There was a logic in it that he recognized as the logic of the whole process. Not the shortest path, but the path that arrives whole. On the afternoon of that same day, Martha asked him to prepare for what she had described weeks earlier, and which had hung in the air since then like a promise that time had been ripening. The walk to the traffic light where it had all begun, 320 yards from the building door to the median on the opposite side of Independence Avenue, without Julian at his side, with the white cane and eyes that caught light and shadow and outline with a clarity still imperfect but real, the clarity of someone at the start of a recovery that will continue if worked on with consistency over the following months. They went out at 5 in the afternoon, when the October sun had returned after the rain, and the avenue had that specific quality of post-rain light that washes the asphalt and leaves everything a degree sharper than it was before. Martha walked beside Arthur without holding his arm, because she had learned over 8 months that he needed presence, not support, and that the difference between the two things is exactly what separates dependence from companionship. He crossed the entire avenue. He reached the median on the other side with his cane, and his breathing controlled and his shoulders in a position that Julian, if he had seen it, would have recognized as the posture of someone who did something they had decided was no longer possible. There were flowers in the median, not lavender, they were potted yellow bells, but there was something in the smell of the post-rain air mixed with the soil of the flower bed that carried some floral quality Arthur recognized with his sense of smell before anything else. He didn't cry this time. It was quieter and deeper than crying. It was the kind of arrival that doesn't need celebration because it sustains itself by the weight of what it cost and the lightness of what was now possible. He reached out his hand to Martha. She placed hers in it. It wasn't a business handshake. It was 2 hands verifying that this was real. It was. 3 days later, on a morning when Martha was in the park near the Washington Avenue overpass, picking lavender from the public flower bed as she had done for 94 mornings during the hardest period, Arthur appeared. He had walked alone the 300 yards from the apartment where he had spent the night in Julian's company, guided by the cane and the light that was returning, slowly, like a road that reopens after a long closure. He reached the flower bed. He stood beside her without saying anything for a moment. Then he said, "How is the smell?" She looked at him. Then she looked at the stems she had between her hands. He continued, "You told me about your grandmother, that she said the smell of lavender reminds the body that it's still worth existing." Martha stayed motionless for a second. Had she told him that? She had mentioned her grandmother in one of the sessions, in a conversation that had arisen naturally when he had asked about the habit, but she hadn't said the full sentence. She was sure she hadn't said the full sentence. "I didn't say that to you," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it was what I was thinking when I entered the flower bed. It reminds one that it's worth seeing. And then I realized I couldn't know that without someone having planted it before." Martha stood with the lavender stems between her hands and looked at Arthur Sterling with those eyes that calculated. And this time, she wasn't calculating anything. She was just seeing, with the quality of presence that 23 years of practice and 94 nights under an overpass and a lavender sapling in a clay pot and a pink cardboard folder had built in her. The quality of seeing what is before you without adding or taking anything away. "The body sometimes knows what the mind doesn't reach," she said. "And maybe that's how things work, not through the paths we plan, but through the ones the nervous system remembers." He reached out his hand. She put hers in it. They stayed that way for a moment, standing in the lavender bed of a public park in Albany, in upstate New York, with the October sun in the air and the smell that reminds you it's worth it. In the weeks that followed, the review process moved forward with the reports Arthur's lawyers had organized, the testimonies of former patients who had agreed to testify, and the analysis that had identified inconsistencies in the original documentation of the report. The colleague who had engineered Martha's fall hadn't counted on the possibility that, 3 years later, someone with resources and determination would decide that errors have a possible correction when one has the courage to look for it. The formal process was underway and the lawyers were competent and the material was solid. Claire went back to the rhythm of Monday meetings with her father, but with something different in the quality of the conversations. There was space now for what used to stay beneath the agendas. She continued running the operations with competence. Arthur continued participating in strategic decisions. But there was, between the two of them, a new honesty that made every conversation more real than those they had had in the previous 3 years, because the ones they had had before carried the unspoken weight of the two fears that neither had named to the other. Julian Hayes bought fresh lavender every week, not because anyone had asked, because he had learned, in the 8 months of treatment, that certain things need to be kept alive by the deliberate act of those who understand their value. And Martha Vance, on a November afternoon, placed the lavender sapling from the clay pot of the Hamilton Street apartment in a soil bed she had prepared in the backyard of the house she had rented, with the first month paid with her own resources from having received a formal advance for the clinical work performed. She knelt, sunk the roots into the earth, and packed it down with the hands that had signed clinical files and written scientific articles and sewn a patchwork blanket and knocked on the window of an imported sedan at a 42-second traffic light. She stood up. She looked at the sapling. There was a man in Albany who was learning to see again. There was a review process that was returning what had been unjustly taken. There was a daughter who had learned the difference between holding on and letting go. There was an assistant who had bought lavender with his own money because it was the right thing to do. And there was a park with a public flower bed where every day, early on, someone picked stems that smelled of the memory that it's still worth existing. It wasn't the story she had planned, but they were, all of them, the stories the nervous system had remembered at the right moment. And maybe that's how the truest things arrive. Not through the paths we trace, but through the ones the body patiently keeps. Dear listeners, Arthur and Martha's story has come to an end, but what it plants in each of us can continue to grow. If this journey of courage, healing, and beginning again touched your heart, leave a comment sharing which part of the story stuck with you, because each of your comments tells us that these stories matter and motivates us to keep bringing more of them. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the time. Click subscribe now and turn on the bell so you don't miss any of the stories we prepare for you. And just as Martha chose to knock on a window without asking permission because she knew it was the right moment, we also knock on your window every week with stories that aren't afraid to be true. Like the video If Arthur and Martha's Journey Was Worth Your Time, we will be here, as always, when you want to come back.